This video is about understanding academic writing. So if you are faced with the mammoth task of writing your own thesis, then you are in the right place. In terms of where do you start, what do you look for, and what sort of things would help you along the way to write your thesis, that is PhD or master's. So you are in the right place because this book by Singh and Lukkarila, dated 2017, is one of the best that I've seen in terms of teaching and explaining how to do academic writing in the right way and what to look for. So what I will be covering is two things based on their book, especially from two chapters. So I will be talking about thesis coherence and thesis tone and style. So let's look at thesis coherent structure. Something that you need to worry about is the structure of the thesis itself. So structure is about the organization of ideas in a text. It is the order in which ideas are presented. The structure of a text is its framework. Our job as students is to write for the reader's sense of order or coherence. Think like how a reader in academic writing would read with specific structural expectations. This is very useful for you to think about. When we read, we are constantly expecting and predicting. So don't let others see a mismatch because this leads to confusion and frustration. So these are very, very important ways to think about your thesis as a starter in terms of coherence. Now, there are levels of coherence that Singh and Lukkarila talked about in their book related to academic writing. Coherent structure is created, they argue and explained that coherent structure of a thesis is created on multiple levels: the macro level, the meso level, and the micro levels. So let's talk about and let's explain and look at each one of these levels. The macro level of coherence is the overall structure of the text. It includes the section and subsection titles, some determined by the text type, while others are decided by us as the writers. The macro level reflects the general thought progression we believe the reader needs in order to buy into our argument. Then they explain that there is another level, the middle level, which they call the meso level. The meso level of coherence in academic writing is the organization of ideas within the sections or subsections. In other words, the order of paragraphs within a section of your thesis. It reflects the thought progression that we want the readers to understand the main point of the section or subsection. And then we've got the third level, which is the micro level. It is the organization of sentences within a paragraph. It reflects the thought progression that we believe the reader needs to understand the point of the paragraphs that we are putting together in a thesis. So, coherent writing is really tied and closely linked with our patterns of thinking. This is the best way to think about it. Academic writing in general uses what they called, Singh and Lukkarila, problematizing approach. The overall thought pattern for us is to identify a problem and lead the reader to a logical solution, if you like. While doing this process, we lead the reader to a new or at least updated conclusion concerning the problem. In this process, we are convincing the reader on why our argument is coherent, and that is when we have to follow certain expected standards of the research process to convince the readers or convince our examiners or supervisors and so on. Within this broad problem conclusion pattern, writers usually structure or you as a student usually have to structure your thoughts using other patterns. These are organizational patterns that writers can choose to follow to make it easy for readers to follow their arguments. 4 specific organizational patterns can be found in most academic research writing, and some of these I listed on this slide, which are hierarchical organization, classification, cause-effect organization, and parallelism. So let's look at these. Hierarchical organizational pattern. It begins with a big or more concept in some way and moves into something that is less or smaller. This pattern of writing is used to organize ideas which are not equal. For example, one idea is more important or more general than another. All the 3 structural levels are used in this pattern. Let's look at also classification. In here, writers, or you as a writer, break down a bigger topic into smaller topics. This is different than hierarchical organization patterns because the order here is not based on principles of hierarchy. This comes in handy in 2 ways: analysis, where we break things into chunks or into parts, and also our responsibility as writers, as students, to break larger topics into smaller topics. Classification pattern can also be found at all the levels of academic writing, from macro to micro levels. Then we can look at the cause and effect pattern. This is when we go into some sort of a discussion of causes and effects as part of our argument building. More common to see this type of hierarchical organization or classification patterns in our writing. And then the 4th one is about one aspect of language structure that is fundamental aspect of academic writing in general, that we create parallel writing structures. This type of organizational pattern is especially relevant to classification because once you establish that you are following a specific pattern, then you need to make it easy for readers to follow that pattern. This means following the proper vocabulary, grammar construction, maintaining the order we established at the beginning of the pattern of our thesis or writing. And here I provided some examples from Singh and Lukkarila's book, which touches on some of these hierarchical organizational patterns that we use at each of these 3 levels of coherence in academic writing. So at the macro level, you could see I put the example that they use, which is you put introduction, citizenship, belonging, and landscape, and then you progress into citizenship and belonging in the Australian context, the rural-urban fringe, citizenship and belonging, and then you move on to context and methodology, and then you move on to conclusions. So this is how you do it for a macro level in your thesis. Another example at the meso level, you could see here there are specific divisions that you create within the macro level, and you put text that reflects this meso level. And then also I've included an example that you can use of some of these patterns at the macro level, which is the paragraph level, as I explained earlier. Back to the patterns mentioned on the slide before, the hierarchical pattern is about ordering ideas from more to less or bigger to smaller. So what we are doing, in other words, is narrowing down the beginning idea to ideas that are more and more specific. In doing so, there are few language strategies used in writing that could help you as a student. One of the language strategies used is around word choice. So words exist on a couple of different continuums. One is from abstract to concrete. So for example, love versus a kiss. Another is from general to specific, like the example above where we can create a coherent structure for an argument that ultimately relates to the importance of, say, iPads. So you can see here we move on from technology to personal computers, to laptops, to mobile devices, and then all the way to iPads. So here you could see the word choice moved on from abstract to a concrete, and you're going to use the same thing in your thesis. The second strategy that Singh and Lukkarila talked about is around noun phrases. Noun phrases are parts of sentences that function as nouns, usually subjects and objects. One example on the slide that I've put in shows how a noun words can begin with one word and then expand into many by adding what they called modifiers. So you start with a noun and then you expand on the nouns incrementally. So you can see here, we moved on, for example, a thesis. You move on from students to international students to undergraduates, international students to undergraduate, international students, prima articulated undergraduate, international students, and so on. So using noun phrases. So you add word modifiers incrementally in here throughout your thesis. And then the third strategy that they talked about is around signal words or phrases that you can use. So writers typically use signal words or phrases to move from more to less or bigger to smaller phrases, like, for example, even though, yet, etc. And I've put in here a website, a very useful website that I've used that you can refer to, which also Singh and Lukkarila refer to in their book, which goes through words that you can use to link and to progress in your thesis. Now, there are also language standards that we can use when we are classifying and writing. This is another useful thing to think about in your academic writing as a student for your PhD and for your master's. So the first one happens when we introduce a classification pattern. We use classifications of the terms on the slide, like, for example, types, kinds, categories, groups, elements, parts, domains, factors, elements, and so on. There is language to specify the number of specific classifications that exist. So, for example, 3 domains, or you can say many, various, numerous, several, etc., which imply that there is a selection on our part. There is also language to imply a selection of some sort, like the most or the primary. And when we classify, we usually define something, and because of this activity, we can use classification arguments with terms such as refer to, comprise, is composed of, include, consist of, is defined as, is characterized by, and so on. So this, hopefully, the language of classification gives you some ways to classify in your writing. Singh and Lukkarila also talked about the language of cause and effect. Our writing involves dealing with cause and effect as part of your argumentation building. And for this pattern, we can use signal words or phrases like the ones in the table that I've put in the table above. Like, for example, conjunctions or expressions such as because, due to, for this reason, as a result. We can use verbs to indicate cause and effects in our writing, like, for example, cause, create, produce, affect, lead to, influence. We can use transitions to build up our cause and effect arguments, such as consequently, therefore, thus, accordingly. And we can use also nouns, like, for example, reason, effects, results, and consequence. Singh and Lukkarila also talked in their book, under chapter 5, pages 100 to 111, about the importance of thinking about thesis tone. And they defined thesis tone as something that consists of hedging, signal phrases, and meta commentary. Hedging is about using words such as may, might, appear, possible. Signal phrases is about using things like author X, proposed, noted, or according to author X, and so on, that we tend to use in, for example, our literature review section of our thesis and so on. They also talked about meta commentary to build up to reflect the thesis tone. And these include things like the use of words like of course, indeed, that is, essentially, to clarify, X aligns with Y, and so on. So all of these three things, hedging, signal, phrases, and meta commentary, are crucial to think about in order to drive your thesis tone. And then finally, Singh and Lukkarila also talked about thesis style, that we need to think about the style and ensure cohesive style throughout our thesis. And they used things like, and they talked about things like repetition, reader cues, and grammar. When it comes to repetition, there is exact repetition, like variations on a words. Like they talked about substitution, the use of synonyms, pronouns, categorical nouns, elaboration, and they gave examples for how to substitute and how to avoid exact repetition, or even use exact repetition in some cases. They also talked about reader cues, thinking about things like transitions, directional cues, and conjunctions. And they also talked about grammar, which is very important in terms of ensuring parallel structure, blending active and passive voices. So hopefully this gives you an idea about the importance of academic writing and what to think about in terms of academic writing when you start writing your thesis. The material was taken from Singh and Lukkarila's book dating 2017, named Successful Academic Writing, A Complete Guide for Social and Behavioral Scientists, which I found to be very crucial. In fact, if you want to write your thesis in a way that is accessible and in a way that makes sense and is comprehensible.